humans are, if not one of the most effective species at adapting to change. Because we go through the emotions we go through, and we process through them, and we work through them, and we work through it together, oftentimes with the help of coaches, peers, mentors, that we adapt to change.
Hello there, it's me, Steve Meller, and welcome in to Growth Ready. On this episode, I get to sit down in person with Dr. Benjamin Granger, Chief Workplace Psychologist at Qualtrics, to truly understand how we respond to change.
We hypothesize that the more change people have experienced over the last calendar year, the less well-off psychologically they would be. We were dead wrong.
Having written about what makes a leader worth following, Ben is here to help us understand the many facets to self-mastery, how investing in yourself is what makes you truly influential, and how his work and findings ready us to grow into the person we're capable of being, regardless of what comes our way. Welcome into the most recent installment of Growth Ready. I am always excited to be doing these shows, but even more excited when I get to do these shows in person. And I'm excited to welcome in Ben Granger to the show today. And Ben, I already know we have so much to discuss, but you've listened to the show, so you know I have to ask you a question first before we go any further, because we're going to learn so much about you as we go. So Ben Granger, what does it mean to you to be growth ready?
To have a growth mindset and be mentally in having that mental orientation that whatever I'm going to face right now, I'm going to learn as much as possible, and that I can improve at whatever it is, regardless of what the outcome would be performance-wise.
Okay. So already we've got the recognition of the capacity on the front end. So mental orientation, we're going to unpack that term. Love that term already. There's also an inner, you're recognizing there needs to be a belief that you can in fact learn. So there's some adaptive qualities in there as well that I'm hearing. And I'm hearing that regardless of what it is you may encounter on the back end, whether the outcome is as positive as it gets or as negative as it gets, so to speak, that we all have that ability to still remain growth-minded, to still move forward. So I would love to learn, based on your story, where is it you've pulled that definition for what it means to be growth ready?
If I go back to when I was a kid, I had what I would consider a fixed mindset about myself. You're an athlete. I was an athlete. My kids are athletes. I coach young athletes. And one of the things I recognize in myself looking back, and what I also recognize in young kids that I coach, is that they often view themselves as fixed beings. You pick up a baseball bat, you jump in the pool, and you're not great at it.
Right.
Or my kids right now are trying to learn golf. And it's like, yeah, golf's hard, guys. It's not easy. Really, you can't just pick up a club and hit it like the pros. And so when I was young, I just viewed myself as like, well, not very good at baseball. I guess I just wasn't cut out for baseball. Struggled with English in school. I thought, hey, I guess English is just not for me. Maybe I'm just more a math guy. And the more I started studying in psychology, so I'm a psychologist, I started to realize that is not objectively true. So even though I'm a psychologist, I'm fascinated by the brain, the neuroscience, what's going on in the physical structure of the brain that allows us to have a mindset, for example, or powers our thoughts. And what is objectively true is that through practice and quality repetition, you can get better at anything.
Yeah.
Now, it is true that, I deal in statistics, so the whole bell curve. Everybody knows the classic bell curve. And it is true that if you looked at everybody's unique ability on any given skill, let's say swimming for you, Steve, you can place everybody on the planet on this bell curve of their natural swimming ability. Right. Some people are born to be good swimmers. Some people are born to be very good at English. But what I like to think of it as a growth mindset is about thinking of the internal bell curve. In other words, yeah, we all do naturally fall in this place on this bell curve if we plotted out every human. But when we start a project, new assignment at work, dealing with a new leader, starting a new hobby, a lot of people view it as, oh, well, guess I'm just not good at that. I'm going to stop based on my performance. But again, that's not based on the objective truth that our brains and our incorporeal minds can change with quality, repetition, and practice. We can move up on our little internal bell curve.
Yeah. I feel this need immediately to go to my own childhood based on that story, because in England, once you get to 16, you graduate high school. And then you have 2 years where you select specific subjects that you have a curiosity towards maybe doing in university. Psychology was one of those for me. I failed miserably. For everything that you just said, for all those reasons. Because for me, no one could ever hand me a truth. I couldn't understand, like, wait, 1 + 1 does not it doesn't equal 2. It's not that simple, because I was a grade A math student at that point, but I was also incredibly fixed-minded in my life too, in my teen years. When I think about the way in which I would try to improve in sport, it was, if it didn't go exactly the way I thought it should go, it didn't make sense to me. It's like, coach, explain to me why I didn't just swim faster.
Right.
Because I did the work you told me to do, and I didn't go faster. Make it make sense. Now, I think that's not too unusual.
I agree.
For a child to think that.
I agree.
You know, and you and I are both experiencing that at different age categories with our own kids. But to shift into my mind I now want to better understand, how can we get to the level of comfort in the truth maybe that is not there, that we are searching for? Because I'm kind of hearing that in what you're saying. It's like, maybe we're trying to identify and find a truth to make us somehow feel more at ease with the discomfort that comes with the growth, right?
You're bringing up a really important topic related to this idea of humans really don't like discomfort, right? One of the things we talk about in our research, so I work for a company called Qualtrics. I serve as their chief workplace psychologist. So I do a lot of research on how employees feel about their organizations, how consumers feel about the organizations they do business with. And one of the things I find very often is when we look at employees who are facing a high degree of change in their work, they respond immediately negatively to it. When consumers face a changing product or a deprecating product or a change in the company's pricing strategy, the initial response is negative. So we experience negative emotions at the prospect of change. Often, not always, but often. And one of the things that we are highly motivated to do is relieve ourselves of that unpleasant emotion. But the more I've learned about how humans deal with change, and if we even zoom out and we look at humans as a species relative to other species, humans are, if not one of the most effective species at adapting to change. And I think it's precisely because we go through the emotions we go through, and we process through them, and we work through them, and we work through it together, oftentimes with the help of coaches, peers, mentors, that we adapt to change. So here's one of the fascinating paradoxes we noticed in our research. We did a big study this year. We looked at the perceptions of almost 34,000 global employees across 24 different countries, all major industries. And we hypothesized that the more change people have experienced over the last calendar year, the less well-off psychologically they would be. I would have put money on that. And I joked with my co-researchers that we would have lost a lot of money had we done that, because we were dead wrong.
Wow.
People who experienced a good deal of change and discomfort were better off psychologically than those who experienced less. I think of it like Einstein's theory of relativity. Everybody in our study acknowledged the world is moving super fast. It's accelerating. The speed at which change is happening is accelerating. There's a lot of change. There's a lot of negative emotions swirling around. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. That actually, how we work through those, actually is part of what makes us so effective at adapting to change. And so that's a really important reminder for us, is that it's not the negative emotions that we should try to shield ourselves from. That's a bad goal.
Yeah.
That's a very bad goal for long-term performance. Better goal would be make sure those negative emotions do not become long-term chronic problems. Work through it, work through the change, learn, and all of a sudden, when you look back, and I would ask you, Steve, like, how often in your career have those very unpleasant things you didn't look forward to end up being some of the things you were most proud of?
It's funny because I don't know whether you mentioned the discomfort with English because you wrote a book, because that was another thing we have in common. I was a consistently poor English student growing up, and it was the reason why, despite being a guy that always told stories to people and would then obviously be told, you should write a book. No, I can never do that. I can never do that. But that's because of that ingrained belief. Like, I tried it a few times. I tried writing to a certain standard, and I was told I could not meet that standard for a really long time. So I carried that for the better part of 15 years until one day someone pretty much said, you don't have to write your book the way that they were asking you to write that essay. You get to write it in your voice now. The light bulb went off. And so, because I had proof upon proof that when Steve does things on Steve's terms, Steve can prove that he's very capable. So it suddenly became a different path for the same skill, if you will.
Yeah.
But what I'm hearing too is you explain that. I mean, that study's fascinating. And what it does is it completely reinforces that bell curve that you were talking about at the beginning. There is no bell curve. If there was 34,000 people, for instance, that you researched, that result isn't in fact that result. Like, if it was the initial hypothesis that you may have betted and lost money on, there would be no bell curve in a way, right?
That's a good point.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. I deeply resonate with your example. And just to take it back to my childhood story, because I struggle with English, I pushed myself to get a minor in English in undergrad. It was precisely because of those struggles.
To prove to you, or to prove to, like, what do you think?
I think today I would like to sound profound and say it to prove it to myself, but to be honest, I was proving it to other people.
Right. But I think even in that too, it's. I think we're going to go to, in your initial answer, I heard some evidence of motivation in there too. Like, what is that person's motivation? And I think that's a great example.
Yeah.
In your younger years, you picked the minor. Why? To prove it to people that probably weren't even paying attention by that point. And yet you still did, right? And we're all, I say this as someone who's equally as convicted in that kind of truth, is you commit to something on your own growth journey, believing like, hey, wait until I prove them wrong, whatever it is you're trying to prove, only to find that they may not have even been paying attention, and that you could have been benefiting from this in a way that you weren't even paying attention to. But where I really want to go to here is to piggyback off of that insight around the research is what would you say to someone who's listening to us, who's thinking, I have tried and I have failed so many times, and I'm waiting for the lesson. I'm waiting for the evidence, Ben, that those trials and failures were in fact worth it. Because I'm hearing that, yes, we're not talking about failure right now, we're talking about change. But those two worlds aren't too far apart, at least in terms of human behavior, how we personally look at it. So I'm just curious, like, what does that research do for someone who's maybe listened to this, that for whatever reason doesn't resonate with those, lessons that came out of the research?
I'll give kind of a hard answer, which is, are you looking for the lesson? Which, because, and I don't think you meant this intentionally, but the way you framed that question was essentially like somebody saying, I haven't gotten the lesson yet, as if I'm entitled to the lesson. And if that were the case, like in that persona, if whoever's listening to this podcast is in that space, are you looking for it? Are you going back through your performance and trying to find what it is that you could have done better? one of the things you said earlier that I really like is not everything has to be done by the book. You know, how much of innovation throughout human history has come from people breaking the rules?
Right.
A lot of it, a significant amount of it, and making it their own. And that's a lesson I've learned too about myself in the past is I used to try to learn all the tactics. Like one space I really got into for a long time, and I wrote a lot about this in the book, is the power of body language and the old science of rhetoric, right? The rhetoric that was taught in the streets in ancient Greece, that was many thousands of years later, it was kind of kept to the elites. And now we don't get a lot of that. We just watch those people on TV. Well, I got really fascinated with that. And I wanted to learn how to be the best storyteller on stage when I do a keynote. Right. And I'm sure you're kind of thinking the same way. Yeah. And one of the things I learned after watching my performances, I tried to overdo it. I'd go watch myself and I'd be like, I see all the techniques, but it looks orchestrated. It looks fake. It doesn't look authentic. So one thing I learned to do is, okay, Ben, keep learning, but then integrate it and do it your way. And just lean into who you are. Just like you said, like, I'm going to write the book on my terms. Yeah. I do think that, and we have data on this from consumers especially, people pick up on that. Yeah. What people want today, in my opinion, in this age of everything's fake, I don't trust anybody, they want real authenticity. So let's go back to your question. If someone's struggling through this, they're just not finding the lesson, are you really looking for the lesson? Are you searching for the lesson and then making it your own? How do you make it your own for what makes you authentic and unique? The marriage of those two things is what I think people are really looking out there for, whether it's in a leader, whether it's in an influencer, whatever it might be.
Yeah. And again, what I love about your answer is that straight away it helps us better understand the research. I think that sometimes gets missed in research, is that we have the discovery, and I have no doubt once I read the research in more detail that contextually we learn a lot more, obviously, but to have that lesson that, hey, people that seem to go through change and come out the other side of the change feel better for having gone through the change. The missing part of that is, I think, what you're challenging our listeners on right now is this idea of, okay, well, if you're trying to do this as much on your own terms as possible and make it make sense to you, then you're missing where there could be a lesson that you're just simply not looking hard enough for.
Yeah.
Like you're not looking at the situation enough. You're looking too much at yourself, or you're looking too much at the situation and you're not looking enough at yourself. I think that for me is fascinating in all of this. But it also helps me understand too, is your story on the speaking, I think, is because we're going to get into more self-awareness here as we go through this, because again, so much of what you talk on specifically in the new book comes around this. I find that folks have tendencies, and I notice this in my work all the time, it's like they teach themselves as much as they can teach themselves, believing that it's in the knowing that it's in the mastery of. And for me, I'm hearing that in what you're saying here. You're helping us understand that knowing is not enough.
That's right.
You know, and for you, I'd love for you to just kind of speak to that in more detail now, more in the sense of, yes, you watch that back in your videos to come to that awareness, but what's been the knock-on effect now to having that awareness? What have you now found, and how have you grown now as a speaker because of that awareness? Yeah.
Well, the learning is important. You know, the textbook learning, I'm a big proponent of it. I went to school for 23 years, so I believe in it. Yeah. But I do agree with your point that there's a difference between learning how to do something and actually doing it, and learning how to integrate it into who you are and what you believe in. And one of my favorite thought experiments is, and I do this with groups of people that I work with, is I'll say, how many of you agree that when you're communicating with somebody or you're communicating with a group, that more gets communicated non-verbally than verbally? 80% of the hands shoot up. Everybody intellectually agrees with this. Yeah. And then I follow up with the second question, how many of us operate as if that's true? And everybody smiles and laughs and says, of course we don't. And I don't either. Sure. I know.
Even in the knowing, you don't.
I know this.
And the teaching, and you're the one teaching.
I'm the one teaching this stuff, and I still fail. I still shoot off a text to a group of people, or I send a flat email on black text on a white canvas,
right,
and expect that that's going to build a compelling mental image in the minds of other people, or that my intent behind what I communicated is going to get received. That's never true.
Right.
And so there's a difference. And that's where I think the practice comes in, the quality, repetition, and the practice, and knowing that, all right, now I know. And one of the things I think knowing the techniques and studying does for you is it allows you to integrate the parts that you really like, that are consistent with you, and reject the others and innovate. A great example is, like I'm a big baseball fan. And imagine teaching a new pitcher to pitch a slider or curveball, and you show them how to do it, but you don't explain why, right? So you show them how, but they have no knowledge of the physics, right? That if you're a righty, you're going to tend to come from the right to left. Here's this, when you're batting against a right-handed batter versus a left-handed batter, there's a difference in how that ball is going to show up to them. What ball you want to use. You might not want to use your slider against a left-handed batter if you're a right-handed pitcher. Why is that? So let's say here's the correct hand motion, and let's go practice. But I'm never going to explain to you why.
Right.
Then you end up in a game, and it's a big game, and there's a runner on third, and you got to get one more out, and you're trying to induce a ground ball. Can you innovate?
Right.
Can you adapt to the environment? And I think you're at a much greater you're at a huge disadvantage if you don't know the knowledge.
Right.
But then again, if you learned how to throw a curveball by reading a bunch of books on throwing curveballs and you never threw one, good luck.
Right.
Both are important.
Yeah.
And I think I'm a big fan of doing one, learning, the reading. I'm an avid reader.
Yeah.
But I'm also, let me take this out into the field. And also, back to our point, make it my own.
Yep.
Integrate it into who I am and what makes me unique.
Yeah. And I think your story represents that so much, is a person who, in their most truest self, is an academic at heart. And so you spent so many years in the pursuit of academics in school. And it took, and then equipped with all that knowledge to then have these realizations when trying to best use it, that there is going to be a new bell curve that you now have to go through.
Right.
Around, okay, I have this knowledge, but the knowledge in itself is not enough. And to me, I've always described myself as a graduate of try. Like, yeah, I've always been someone who's willing to try.
Yeah.
And if it means that I failed 25 times in pursuit of that, then the error will be fine, but I'm graduating trial and error every single time to the point of where I'm hopefully going to get comfortable. I've always refrained from the academic side. I've always pushed back on that side. I call myself a social learner in that regard, but it's gotten me so far.
Right.
I now know when I'm in these certain moments, like I was giving you before we even pressed play here today, like I know with my interviews, I need to have a certain understanding. I can't just fly to go, hey, you're a good interviewer, man. Like you just roll with it every single time you sit down with someone. You got to know who you're talking to, And so there's these little moments, I think, in our lives where we just have to acknowledge, like, hey, what's gotten us here won't necessarily get us there.
That's right.
And in your case, I think I'm hearing that in abundance, that comfort you have with now trying it. But to now I want to go to the book now, and I just want to talk about this idea of, a leader worth following, how to master yourself, influence others, and create exceptional experiences. Immediately, just me doing what I do, the mastery of oneself was just what jumped out to me. And I've not read the book yet, so it's just full disclosures, make that clear. But the fact is, this notion to lead with mastering oneself is something I've spent a lot of time. There I am saying I've struggled with academics, but I've actually now really lent into that. And the self-awareness data is frightening, to say the least, in terms of like when you ask a room, hey, who here is self-aware? That 90% of people will put their hands up, but really only 10% of those 90% are actually self-aware. it is frightening. And so I'm curious, for you to write a book about a leader worth following, what is the importance of mastering oneself?
The original title of the book of my early manuscript was actually called Ethical Influence. And it was a play on the Robert Cialdini classic Influence. This has been one of the most impactful books I've ever read, highly recommended for anybody. But he's a social psychologist, and he talked about the different levers of social influence, like essentially what makes people do what they do in social environments. And as I started thinking about that, I was struggling with my own leadership, leading my own team, and I was going through the normal struggles any people leader would go through. And so I was like, I'm going to start just voraciously reading. So I started reading all different subfields of all different sciences, from physics to biology to anthropology to evolutionary psychology to my own home field of organizational psychology. But as I started to think about things like body language and influence tactics, the question that kept nagging at me was, is this manipulation or influence? Like, where's the line between influencing somebody with good intent versus I know all the tactics, so I'm going to use them to get people to do what I want them to do? That's where the master yourself came in. I had this really funny interaction. I actually write about this in the book. I had a new product leader join, and he and I were hitting it off. We were just having some chats. We hit it off immediately, like first call. We're just hitting it off. And then we started talking about difficult executive meetings we've been in, and I was sharing some of the body language tactics that I use when I'm in really tough meetings. And he made this comment. He said, "Whoa, that makes me feel like, are you manipulating me right now?" And he was joking. He said it with a smile. But that question nagged at me for weeks. I was like, where is that line between ethical influence and manipulation? And then it started to come to me gradually. If we as leaders know, if we're committed to the benefit of the group, that's point number one. Our intentions are good, are benevolent. We're trying to help the group. And by helping the group, it helps us as individuals, by the way. If that's true, and we know all the tactics we've studied, we've practiced, and then we don't use them, that's negligence. Or we could master ourselves and understand the effects of self-mastery on the people that we lead and influence. That's the point of this whole book, is that there's nothing wrong with influence. In fact, all of us, regardless of what we do, whether we're students or individual contributors at our company or a senior leader, all of us have a responsibility to lead and influence. But in order to do that ethically and not raise other people's alarms of, I wonder what their motive is, you have to start with yourself. And if you master yourself, watch what happens to the way other people perceive you.
I couldn't agree more with everything you're saying. And the main question I had coming into this was the choice of the word mastery, because so much of what I speak on and what I work on is how the mastery can be the biggest fear factor in all of it. It's like how good can I get at this, or how good do I need to get at this? I'm curious as to why you chose the word mastery, and whether that is that realistic, I guess, as well, in terms of this.
That's a really good point. I actually never thought of that, to be quite honest with you. But the reason I chose it, just to answer that directly, is I don't think there's ever a point at which we will realistically all become, on any given trait, like if you took all the possible traits that we could be good at or measured on, and you plotted us on that bell curve compared to other people, some things are going to be high on the bell curve, some are going to be low, most are going to be in the middle. But then we zoom in and we take, okay, where do I stand? Where's my range on that particular skill? I don't think there's ever a point at which humans get to the point where I've completely mastered myself on everything.
Yeah.
And there's nowhere else to go.
Right.
I don't think that's possible.
Right.
Because you have to focus, for one.
Mm-hmm.
And two, who knows, on the bell curve, right? Not to get too statistical, but in a real bell curve, that little tail is infinite.
Mm-hmm.
It's infinite, right? It doesn't stop. There's no end to the bell curve. It's
Right.
it goes on forever.
Yeah.
That I think is important, and I think is very
it's huge.
reflective of what you're saying is it's the pursuit of the mastery.
Yeah.
And maybe that's what I should have added in there, pursuit of mastery.
But I'm so glad you took us there, man, because for me, and I think that's important. And again, I can't wait to read it because I have no doubt that you don't push that in the book.
No.
We should all be masters. I have no
In
doubt.
fact, in the last chapter, I addressed the pursuit of perfection that's, and I contrast it with good goal setting theory.
Yep.
Notice that in all good goal setting models, there's no perfect.
Right.
It doesn't exist.
Nope.
And as Brene Brown points out, the pursuit of perfection doesn't exist.
Right.
And you can't get you cannot get caught up on that. But
No.
but the pursuit of constantly improving, that's what we need to adopt.
I think that's such an important detail to this entire, considering that you addressed the bell curve early on in this conversation. I think for everyone to get that understanding that the end of the bell curve, because we don't look at it that way.
That's right.
That's the truth, what
That's
you just
right.
shared with us, but we do not look at it that way. We look at it as the end. We look at there's an end point because the page ends, right? Typically when you're looking at that bell curve. But truth be told, there is no end to that bell curve. And I think for everyone listening to this, what you're speaking to, with this notion of the mastery of self, what I love about it for our listeners is not everyone listening to this show is necessarily a person influencing other people. But what I think you've done in how you answered that question is you've created a path for people if they so choose to. Even if their title doesn't imply that they should be leading other people. I think the choice to pursue mastery in oneself, it implies that you will in fact influence other people.
That's right.
The way in which you're addressing it, at
Inevitably,
least.
even
Yeah.
if you don't intend to.
Yeah.
I love your use of the word choice too, several times. That's the key, is people have to choose to go there. This kind of going back, some things I think you'll find interesting, your listeners will find interesting, but similar to growth mindset, one of the things I'd studied when I was in graduate school is an orientation toward learning. So one of the things we know is when people try to take on a new project, a new hobby, a new skill, a new body of knowledge, they can have different mental orientations. One of them is called a learning goal orientation. I'm going to approach this with the goal of improving. Who cares what the results are? Then there's an orientation called performance prove orientation. And this is like Ricky Bobby, if you ain't first, you're last. So it's like, I have to be first compared to other people. And if I'm second, then I'm a loser, right? That I want to be the best at this, whatever this topic is. And then there's this other variation of performance orientation, which is, I just don't want to look like an idiot. I don't want to be last. And what we see is that when people have when they go into any particular task, if their orientation is dominated by, I don't want to be last, those people tend to perform the worst. The people who want to prove themselves as the best, slightly better, they perform better. But ironically, it's the people who have a learning goal orientation who don't go in with the objective of beating everybody else, but it's more, I want to improve and I want to continue to improve and learn as much as possible. Ironically, they're the ones who tend to perform the best at the task in the long term. And that has greatly last point. We weren't born with a learning goal orientation.
Right.
We weren't born with a performance prove.
Yeah.
We can choose to adopt one or the other. That's a choice.
I love that. That you were talking about your kids learning golf. My mind went straight to don't hit it in the water, don't hit it in the water. And then what do? You hit it in the water.
Right.
Like that's it, right? That third description that you provided. And for us to lean into the learning orientation, I think what's great about your story and how I relate to your story is that I was that second until probably 24, 25 years old. It's just like I was all about, I'm going to prove, I'm going to prove, I'm going to prove, I'm going to win, I'm going to win, I'm going to win. It was this all or nothing type of approach. And it wasn't until in the last 5 years of my life that I've really welcomed in the importance of the learning orientation. I think I'm so glad you gave us that. I had it to circle back around in terms of your initial response, because I wanted people to understand what you meant by mental orientation there at the outset in your initial answer. And because for me, I think anyone listening to this who does in any way relate to one of the second or the third, like, I'm curious, is this a consistent approach across someone's entire life or within certain sections of their life? Because my mind went there straight away too, is I think about the work I've done around myself, but I know I'm still guilty at times in certain areas, in certain circumstances of falling right back into that performance guy who just wants to win at all costs. Right. So I'm just curious, like, what does the research say? What does the definition, I guess, say around the ability for us to maybe move across all three given circumstances, I guess?
The research I'm familiar with is that people, depending on the task and depending on how new or experienced they are at it, they will go back and forth.
Yeah.
But again, it's a choice, and that's why we go back and forth across them. But one of the things you pointed out that I think is really important is that during times of high stress, high pressure, high uncertainty, which I think you could classify, ideal in the work world, the business world, for employees across the globe, it's a highly stressful time. It's a highly uncertain time. Those are the times when we are more likely to revert back to our default. And unfortunately, those are the times when we need to break out of our default the most and be more flexible. But we have to recognize that in those times when we're under high pressure and high, that's when we're going to go back to our default. For you, that might be when you revert back to your performance prove. I'm more of a performance avoid, believe it or not. Like when I was growing up, I just didn't want to be last. Right. I just wanted to be part of the group. I wanted to be part of the middle of the bell curve.
Yeah.
I just don't want to be on the tail, getting picked on. That's all I want to do.
I think you are giving our listeners permission that they have that choice. And I think that's huge. I think for people to understand that, I think about my own journey in therapy is that I was an all or nothing guy when I got into therapy. I was prove to the world, and it was at a detriment, and I felt like that was the approach I had to take because it worked for me when I was a successful swimmer. Why wouldn't it work for me in every other capacity of life? And it turns out the world wasn't very receptive to a guy that was constantly trying to prove himself all the time.
I have a good friend, I won't mention his name, he's a great guy, but he often used to say, he's like, Ben, he's a super smart guy.
Yeah.
And he'd say, my goal going into these executive meetings is I want everybody to think I'm the smartest person in the room. And I was like, man, you realize that's a really dumb goal. Like
the irony
that's
of that.
a great way to make everybody else hate you.
Right.
But I think I remembered the point I was going to bring up earlier. It's that, we talked about when we're in those environments that are highly stressful, we kind of go back to our default. But in a work environment, sometimes we find ourselves in that situation where we feel like the stakes are really high, right? This is not a new project for me, or maybe it's not a new skill, but the CEO has eyes on this project. I gotta nail this. And so we orient ourselves to the objective. We orient ourselves to the goal. What I'm not saying is that that is necessarily a bad thing. But what I would suggest is in those periods where we feel like the stakes are extremely high, you might need to set your sights on a metric or a goal or a target. That might be necessary. Your livelihood or your job may depend on it. But along the way, especially early on, try to learn, especially if it's a long project, try to adopt the learning goal orientation at the beginning. And then once you get closer to the end, you can start to apply that, now we have to nail the outcome, as long as we don't get wrapped around the axle of perfection, because that's a impossible goal.
Yeah, and again, you bring up another really interesting path to go down is the way in which we relate to outcomes and goals, and the way we associate how our performance is in fact impacted by our focus on the outcome/goal versus the ability to learn the process at hand. And
Great point.
I hear it all the time. And I as recently as last week, I was in a group session and heard someone make a great point about their process and the way in which it was very specific to their group. And then he finished his point by saying, I just got to tell him, trust the process. And I go, you're forgetting all the context that you just provided me there. Trust the process doesn't mean jack. It doesn't mean anything by itself. But when you provide that beautiful context that you provided to me prior to saying trust the process, you need to find a way to insert that context into the inside of trusting the process. But I think what you're explaining here is that, yes, start with the outcome, start with the goal in mind, understand what that is, but then to really lean in with that curiosity muscle on the front end to say that outcome and that goal is the destination. But you're encouraging everyone here to say, yes, that's great for now, put it up on the whiteboard, but after that, we have to lean in and we have to learn. But you're also giving us permission to eventually get to that point. Like right at the end, like there's going to come a time where the stakes are high.
That's right.
And we have to show up and perform.
Absolutely.
You know, and I think that's okay. I think you're again giving us permission to say, yeah, there will be a time and a place that it will feel as though everything's on the line. You know,
those are real, right? I'm not trying to be Pollyannish about it. Those are very real, and those have existential risks. And so sometimes we do need to nail it. But going in, and the example you used is a really good one. I'm a student of goal setting. One of the things that we know about goal setting theory is that it's one of the most well-supported and validated practices that builds on human motivation theory. There's been over 1,000 studies done on the power of goal setting, and it works. But then you take the practice and you plop it into a messy, complicated organization, and it starts to fall apart. One of the reasons that it falls apart is because the focus becomes solely on the outcome itself. And another point of great irony is what I have found in my work in consulting business leaders around driving certain metrics, whether it's we want to improve the customer experience that we're creating through our products and services, we want to improve the experience our employees are having, we want to improve productivity, we want to improve revenue and margins, whatever that might be, is that becomes the thing that everybody's driving toward. And it's akin, you're a coach, it's akin to going to a team and saying, let's go win the game.
Yep.
That's our goal, right?
Right.
It's to win the game. We got to win the championship. Let's go win the championship. And that's all you talk about.
Right.
That's not helpful coaching.
No.
You have to work, you start with that, and then you have to break it down as to what does Steve need to do? What does Ben need to do? What does Jane need to do? What does Julie need to do? And that's going to be a little different. And what we have to develop and learn along the way is going to help us achieve that goal. But going around reminding people of what the goal is and only focusing on that and not breaking it down into specifically what we can control, that's not helpful.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think you bring up such a good point around the environment within which we do these things. And we cannot get out of this conversation without me diving into organizational components of everything that we've talked about so far because of the work that you do. And I think this is something that some of our listeners may sometimes feel as though we don't get onto this enough, because we do have thought leaders, business owners, executives come on and speak very much through this leadership lens a lot without really getting into the heart of, but if I'm just in an organization, if I'm just part of a team, how does everything that you're talking about, Steve, relate to me?
Right.
And so I think with that being said, when you think about this notion of organizational comfort with the idea of helping people get more comfortable with the process, helping people focus on mastering themselves, how does someone focus on that when maybe they're in this organization where they don't feel as though they have a voice, or their thoughts matter enough for them to even master themselves? Like,
great question.
Talk me through that.
That's a great question. One of the things you pointed out right at the beginning of this was the power of the environment. I have a whole chapter. Chapter 7 is on acknowledging the power of the environment. Talks about the same things of how it's a very uncomfortable thought for a lot of people. to acknowledge that the environment has a huge influence on our mindsets and behaviors. That's uncomfortable to think about whenever we want to think about ourselves as very reasonable, we're logical, we're good-willed. Of course we are. Mm-hmm. But it's uncomfortable to reflect on the reality that in most cases, if you took us and you put us in a very different environment, let's say a toxic culture,
yep.
would we still be the good people that we are or we want to be? That's a really difficult question. Mm-hmm. Most people will say, of course I will. I'm true to my values.
Yeah.
And I truly believe people mean that. But we drastically underappreciate the power of the environment that we're in. When humans are looking for, especially when there's a high degree of uncertainty, mm-hmm. when we're new in an organization, we're looking for what should we be doing? Mm-hmm. We look at the culture. What is culture? The shared behavioral norms, the shared mindsets and behaviors of the group. Would we act totally differently if we're surrounded by a group of people acting one way? Would we act totally differently because it's aligned with our values? Right. For a while.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden start sliding down that slope. Mm-hmm. And then eventually that slope gets real slippery. And one day we look in the mirror and we say, I don't know what I'm looking at.
Right.
I think it's much better for us to know that going in. Mm. So how do you operate in a really tough environment? I get asked this, Steve, this is a fantastic question. I get asked this a lot by middle managers, frontline mm-hmm. leaders,
right.
who's saying like, look, I love what you're saying.
Right.
I love all this. But my leaders are awful. Like it's the culture's toxic. How do we fight against that? How do I operate? How do I apply these things? Mm-hmm. The good news, well, let me start with the bad news.
Okay.
The bad news is you got a much harder job.
Yeah.
Let's be real.
Yep.
And I think thinking anything else is foolish.
Mm-hmm.
Expect that you got a harder job on your hands. Go into it with that expectation. But here's the good news, is even within a toxic culture or a tough culture where you have tough leadership, that's very common. You can have good, healthy climates inside of an organization. And I think about like a company has a big ball. Mm-hmm. And let's say you got a big company, hundreds of thousands of people. Some of my clients even have millions of employees, which is hard to get my mind around.
Yeah, really hard.
So you have thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, but then you have a little marketing group, and you have your Asia Pacific group, and you have your team in Sydney, Australia, and you have your group in Canada, and you have your sales organization. Within that broader organization are subclimates. Mm. You have a sales team inside of the sales department in Canada, right? So you can keep breaking these little bubbles down. What I suggest leaders do is, if they're in those tough environments, build the culture from the inside out. Mm. Create a good team climate in your team. For example, when I've managed teams and we've gone through organizational change, that's the goal that I set for myself, is to create a climate where people feel psychologically safe. Mm-hmm. Did they feel psychologically safe outside of the walls of my team? I don't know. I think some of them would say sure, some of them would say no.
Yep.
But at least within my team, within my purview, what I could control, that was my goal, is to create that safe environment. Now imagine you have a big organization and you have a couple of leaders who start chipping away at that. Mm. Well, what's that going to start to do? That's going to start to create some FOMO, and you're going to start to influence from the bottom up and from the inside out. That can change an organization. Yeah. Your job's tougher. Yeah. Be real about that. I'm not going to sugarcoat that, but it is possible to operate. Yeah. Control what you can control.
I think using the word climate is essential here, because culture is such an ambiguous term. It's just like you don't know where to start with it half the time.
Right.
And
right.
Whereas climate, it feels like straight away we are literally measuring something, and for someone to say, is this a strong climate? Is this when you say strong, great culture, it's like, yeah, but that could mean 1,000 things to 1,000 people. When you talk about a climate, immediately straight away I'm inclined to say, okay, I want to know more about what your climate represents. Like what's the identity of your climate? Where do you even start with that climate? And I would like to believe quite quickly I can understand what's being measured. And your values probably are going to be somehow involved in that measuring process of the climate. You know, so for me, a climate is quite literally a scale when used in certain
That's a really
modes,
interesting point.
you know. And so for me, that's I can't help but go there, just because I think anyone listening to this who's maybe looked at things culturally before, if we would just simply replace it with climate, I think straight away that we are encouraging ownership on a much higher level right away. I don't know what you think about that.
That's a great takeaway. I'd actually never thought about that. The measurability or the implied measurability of climate versus culture. Totally agree with your comment about culture being this thing that everybody kind of intuitively gets what it is. But I bet if we were to walk at 100 random people outside of here, we asked them to define culture, you get 100 different answers.
Yeah.
It's very ethereal.
Yeah.
But one of the ways I really like what you're saying is if there's something that you tangibly can control in that environment, and I'll give some tips from our research. The two most fundamental things that a leader can do, or even an individual contributor who's working with a team, can do in a tough environment like that, in a tough culture where the behavioral norms, that's how I define culture, by the way, shared behavior norms. When that's rough, focus on psychological safety and trust. Because if you can build relationships where they're trusting at an individual level, that's reciprocal. And when people feel psychologically safe around you, like in other words, I'm a leader, but my team members feel comfortable coming and tell me the brutal, honest truth, even about myself, something I did. If I can create that environment, we can go anywhere together. If that doesn't exist, then it's a roll of the dice as to whether I'm going to be able to get what I want out of that team or what I need out of that team, or even nudge that team toward a shared group goal. Because they may self-sabotage.
I think the point you bring up here too is I think climate is so much more in alignment with self-mastery too. I think someone can actually connect with, if I'm working on this in myself, then I can make this part of our climate. It makes so much more sense in that regard. And again, work that we do is about standards first. Like, I know you have a mission statement, I know you have values, but we're going to create standards within your organization. And in implementing those standards, we, again, going back to this notion of tangibles and measurables, we now have something we can actually say, are we upholding the standard or are we not? It should be a simple yes or no. And that can help a person who's wondering sometimes, where do I fit? Am I performing correctly? Whatever it might be. But I think that's what I love about, we've heard the word culture on this podcast so many times. For you to go that little bit further with our listeners and incorporate this notion of the climate, I think that gives everyone this understanding of like, okay, what are we measuring? And then you can even go one step further and say, what am I measuring in myself? You know, and that's where this self-mastery starts. I think it's all intertwined in such a beautiful way.
I loved how you picked up on this too, because I'll point out, I talked about the importance that foundational trust in a good climate or a good culture, that trust is essential. But how do you build trust? How can you be viewed as trustworthy? Let's imagine somebody who's out there preaching from the pulpit about what we should be doing, and then behind closed doors, I do exactly the opposite.
Right.
Is anybody going to trust you? No. So in our work, we go out and we measure, how do employees feel about their senior leaders? Do they trust them? We ask consumers, do you trust the brand you do business with? We essentially ask employees and consumers to rate leaders in their organizations through 3 different lenses. Is that person competent? Do they have the knowledge and skills they need to lead us to do what we need to do? Second, do they have integrity? Or do they behave consistently with their stated values? Do they walk the talk? But the third, the most forgotten and yet most important factor is benevolence. That is the implied motive from the other person's perspective. I think one of the most tragic examples throughout history, but everybody's going to resonate with it, is Hitler. and you look at Hitler from a purely objective standpoint,
Yep.
Let me start by saying what he did was absolutely horrific.
Mm-hmm.
But if you were to look at Hitler's leadership style objectively and you said, did he have competence at communicating? As much as I hate to say it, yeah.
Yeah.
He was a highly effective communicator.
Yeah.
Did he have integrity in the sense that he behaved in ways that were consistent with what he said he was going to do? From that definition of integrity. Now, I think in a broader definition of integrity, you would say absolutely not.
Right.
But if you just were to operationally define it as, did he do what he said he was going to do? I think, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he wrote a book, Mein Kampf, and he did pretty much exactly what he said he was going to do.
Yeah.
Did he have benevolence? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. It was all about him and his objective, and everybody else essentially was the enemy. And certain groups in particular, like Jews.
Yeah.
Lack of benevolence. Now look at that equation. Is Hitler trustworthy? Absolutely not.
Right.
Why? Is it because he wasn't competent? No. Is it because he wasn't consistent in his behaviors? No, that's not why. It's because he lacked benevolence.
Yeah.
So as an extreme example, taking it to the real world today, when we go and we look at how consumers are rating organizations they do business with, 3/4 of the global consumer base say, yeah, the companies I do business with, they're competent. 3/4 of the consumers say, yeah, the companies I do business with engage in fair business practices. They do what they say they're going to do. But when they make decisions about their products and services or the pricing, I'm not sure why they're doing it.
Yeah.
Go to employees. 2/3 of employees think their senior leaders are competent and have integrity. Half think their leaders have benevolence. In other words, half of the global workforce thinks that their senior leadership is doing what they're doing to save a buck or gain a buck.
Right.
And they don't care what's in the benefit for the employees. Right. The implied motive. And so it goes right back to what you're saying. That's where self-mastery comes in. Mm-hmm. If you don't really believe in this stuff and you're spouting it out, good luck building trust with anybody in the long term.
Gosh, I'm so glad that we touched on this because it's such a personal quest on this mastery journey that we're talking about, because we would so be inclined to lead with the competence and the integrity. We would so, like, again, we go back to the knowledge, but this is where we've hit this a couple times now. The competence,
and those are important.
They are. The competence piece immediately implies go learn, go get good. You know, the integrity piece, like I said, I'm going to do it. I'm going to get it done. Now, if you focus only on those two things, that can lead to someone who's incredibly knowledgeable and very tired too, probably. You know, like this is kind of a burnout thing that we could maybe have a recipe for. So the benevolence part of it too, it's if you are working with someone that has your best interest in mind as well, then you're going to actually be protected in how you execute those first two things as well. Because I know you're talking about this from the perspective of the leader, but it's reciprocal. There's both sides of it.
100%.
Like this is, you are practicing it from the leadership standpoint, but to do it to a point where you are practicing this self-mastery, this awareness of self, you're doing it in a way to where you're inviting the person you're leading to do the same. Like that's what I love about this. Is it is completely a collaboration if done correctly from a leadership standpoint. And it touches on the last piece as well of the title of the book, The Exceptional Experience. Because that, again, can't wait to read it, because for me, that's where I'm most curious. I've done a lot of work around self-mastery. I've done a lot of work around influencing others. The experience piece of this, aside from a couple of books in the hospitality world, that's really the only lens I've looked at it through. I can't help but almost anticipate where you're going with this point, even just on what we've just discussed there. Is like if you are practicing benevolence effectively, you are in fact creating an experience that people want to be involved in.
Sometimes it's the simplest things that matter. When one of my professional colleagues, Dr. Khalifa Oliver, says, you know, to be a good leader, it's really simple. Just actually care about your people. You know, sometimes it's like that simple.
Right.
But it is true. Mm. One of the things we find is when employees, when consumers view their leaders as benevolent. They really believe that there's a shared objective. What they are doing, there's something in it for me. They're much more willing to forgive people's mistakes. They're much more willing to give you the benefit of the doubt when they know your heart's in the right place. And let's be honest, we're all going to make mistakes. I mean, that's where we started the conversation,
right.
Acknowledging that that's inevitable. And we shouldn't actually shy away from that necessarily, except in the high stakes. And, we talked about that exception. But if you are really demonstrating, and I think this is where the self-mastery part comes out, that you are really working on yourself, you really believe in what you're espousing because you apply it to yourself, you're inevitably going to create good experiences for other people. That's going to be an inevitable byproduct. And that, like you said, is reciprocal. It's going to rebound. It's going to affect the employees that you lead. It's going to affect the people you work with. It's going to affect your consumers. That's going to affect the experience your colleagues have with those consumers in the future. There's this beautiful reciprocal cycle that forms. Or we can bypass the self-mastery and we can create a vicious cycle that feeds itself and spirals down.
Yeah. I'm so glad that we arrived at this point, because I'm always concerned, especially when we bring leadership into the discussion, that there's going to be people listening that maybe feel as though this episode isn't for them.
You're right.
And I'm so thankful that we've been able to arrive at this juncture to be able to help people understand that if we practice self-mastery correctly, we will evolve into the leader we're capable of being, whether or not that leader is in fact needed within our particular life, within our particular career, respectively, whichever direction you choose to go. But the good news is that if we start with that, and we start with things like competence, integrity, benevolence, that we position ourselves at any point to shift into leadership. It could be within your own household, right?
Exactly.
It doesn't have to be within a Qualtrics, doesn't have to be within a million-person organization, whatever it might be. It can be anywhere within your life. And I think what you have allowed us to understand here, Ben, is this equation, if you will, of the mental orientation, what it is we can learn, and regardless of the situation and how you answered that initial answer, you've helped us understand every single bit of that along the way in this hour. And I would happily speak with you for another hour, but our listeners are used to us going about an hour. And hey, this, if anything, it just means that when the next book comes along, we might just have to do this again.
Yeah, we could do it again.
But Ben, listen, before I let you go, brother, where can we, I know there's plenty of platforms for us to learn more about you, and I want to give people a chance to access your book too. So where can we learn more about you and access the book?
Great place to go is benjamingranger.com. I have a little website centered around the book. You can access a lot of my other writing and podcast episodes I do, but it has a link to the book, all online platforms you can get it. And also added this one thing. We were kind of jamming this off the screen. We were jamming out with the guitar in the studio here. So I'm a big music nut. Yeah. And one of the things that is also on the website, which, being now in Louisiana, you'll appreciate this, is on the Lagniappe page.
Yeah, I saw that on the website. Yeah.
So this is a playlist that accompanies the book. So I have songs that influence my writing, organized by chapter of the book. The funny backstory here is I'm a first-time author. Yeah. So I learned a lot of hard lessons along this process. Yeah. My first draft of my manuscript had like 30 song quotes weaved in as epigraphs and things. And I sent it to the editor, and she's like, "Oh, this is awesome. Do you have permissions to use all these song quotes?" I'm like, "Well, I don't know what that is." Right. It's like, "Yeah, you can't do that." The artists get a little fussy about that. Yeah. So I had to pull it all out, sadly. But what I did was, the music is a major influencer for me, not just in my personal life as a hobby, but also in my professional life. I find a lot of meaning in it and connection. Yeah. So I created it. It's a little scavenger hunt for the reader. Like, what's the lesson this song is trying to teach? But also it's a great memory aid, because memory actually helps us remember the lesson. So that's another place.
I figured there had to be an academic tie to it somewhere.
Of course, of course. I'm a nerd.
Well, I like to believe that in the course of this conversation, we've given you the space to, really give your nerd, the space it needed to come out. But also, I'm so glad that we've had enough space and opportunity to learn more about your story and just really give so much of what could easily be considered academic, like the essence it deserves to make it relatable to us as just human beings. So, Ben, I appreciate this. This was an absolute pleasure, and thanks for joining the show, brother.
Right back at you, man. Thanks for having me. Thanks for the platform.